Heidi here from Rain Country. God is good all the time. And I'm here today to talk about the best sugars to use when it comes to fermentation. Now, obviously, not everything we ferment we add sugar to, such as fermented vegetables and more. When I'm making kimchi or fermenting onions or fermenting garlic, I don't add sugar to that. But there are certain ferments that you do need to add sugar to, and some of the examples of that would be vinegar, wine, like I have here, a completed bottle of Pacific Northwest blackberry wine that I made myself, some wine that I've got brewing from my own grapes, some mead over here, the name of it rubbed off, I think it was a raspberry or mixed berry mead, and I think I mentioned the vinegar, fermentation starter, or making natural soda, such as like a spruce tip soda, which is one of my very favorites, or even calendula soda, which is quite delicious, or whatever sounds good. In fact, I'm thinking about using that beet juice powder that I got from Anthony's and some lemonade and fermenting that, making a nice little fizzy fermented drink out of that. So that's not a wine, that's just a fizzy fermented drink because it only takes a few days to get it nice and bubbly. But yes, those need sugar to get a good ferment, especially when you're talking wine and vinegar. In order for those to be nice and strong, even if you're using straight juice like I did here off of the grapes or off of the blackberries, for the wines, you still need to add sugar, even though there's already sugar in the juice. And vinegar, you have to have real sugar, not some kind of fake replacement sugar, because it has to eat through the sugars in order to make the alcohol, which then gets converted to acetic acid. And the more sugar that you use, the stronger it's going to be. Though I did a video a couple years ago where I talk about sugar amounts. And I didn't think to go into detail in the videos about the types of sugars, but sugar amount matters. Too much sugar can kill a ferment, but not enough, like with vinegar and wine. If you don't have enough, you're not going to get a good finished product. But I'll link to that video down below where I go into more detail about that. So today it's about the types of sugar. There's only two types that I use. One is the organic cane sugar, which it's in a green jar, so it looks green. But here's a bag of what I buy. I get it from Costco. And so this is the color. It's a nice blonde color, which means it still has just a little bit of molasses left in it. And it's organic and it's cane sugar. This is all very important to me when it comes to fermenting. I don't use highly processed white sugar. I don't recommend beet sugar because if it's just labeled white sugar and not cane sugar, that means it's made from genetically modified beets. I do not recommend that. It would work. I don't recommend it because it's the least healthy sugar there is out there. It's highly processed, it's genetically modified, where an organic cane sugar like this it's still processed some, but it's not as highly processed as your white beet sugar. Then the other thing that I will use is honey. I don't use honey as often because it is far more expensive to us than getting the cane sugar. But my favorite honey is the Glory Bees Raw Pacific Blackberry honey. So raw honey is what I'm always looking for. And I get this actually, even though you can order it directly from Glory Bee, which I'll put a link to their site down below. I've actually been getting this for the best price at Costco more recently. And so I don't know if they still have it. I haven't bought a gallon bucket of it in a while. But anyway, that is my favorite. Now, honey is something I'd use when I'm making the honey fermented garlic, you know, a honey infused garlic, and you let it ferment for a few days. Or when I'm making homemade meads, which I don't do as often as I used to because I get so much juice from my grapes and from blackberries and from apples and from rhubarb that I make wine. So the difference between the two is wine is something that you ferment from juice. It's all pure juice that you've added sugar to and some kind of fermentation starter like I have here. Some people use a special wine yeast or bread yeast. And then mead is made from honey and water. You don't necessarily use juice when you're making mead, but I've always added fruit to my meads just to give it different flavors. So for example, and I have a video, by the way, on mead making. which you can find in the whole winemaking playlist, which I'll link to down below. I also have a video recipe on my rhubarb margarita wine, which is what I call that. But even though we don't drink, I do make wine out of a lot of the stuff I have because I do a lot of cooking with it, marinating with it. Oh, and definitely making extracts, medicinal extracts with that. Instead of using vodka, it's cheaper for me to do that. It's healthier. I know what's in it. And no, it's not as strong as a vodka, but I do a blend of my homemade wine and raw honey whenever I'm making a medicinal extract. Most of them, that is, such as the pain one, the one I use for helping with sleep and relaxing the muscles or just calming the nerves. There's only a few medicinal extracts I make, but in those ones, that's what I use, is my homemade wine and the raw honey. The raw honey adds a nice flavor and benefits to it as well. So those are the only two that I can really recommend. I'm not saying you can't use other types of sugars, but I don't recommend using sugars like coconut sugar, which I do use for baking quite a bit. I add it to cookies, breads, and so on. Coconut sugar can be very useful in a lot of things. And then you have your other dark sugars like the turbinado, the rapadura. I can't remember the names of them all because I haven't used them all. But if it's, even just brown sugar because of the molasses content, and certainly not molasses on its own. And the reason for that is, even though you might get these things to ferment, you're just not going to get as good of a ferment, especially when you're talking about something like water kefir grains. If you're using, because I made the mistake of using coconut sugar when I was doing the water kefir for a while, and it was making my grains less active. They were getting smaller and they weren't reproducing as well. In fact, they just stopped reproducing altogether. And then I learned it was because of the high mineral content in the coconut sugar that was basically killing off my grains. And that will do the same thing to any of your basic ferments. If you have a high mineral sugar, having some minerals in there is fine, but a high mineral content can really slow or stop a ferment. So this is why I stick with mostly the organic cane sugar, because it's the best for the price and it works, it's organic, and it's not super high in minerals where I have to worry about it affecting the quality of the ferment that I get. And again, of course, if you keep bees, then obviously honey is an awesome one. Honey ferments very well. Some people think raw honey won't ferment because it's naturally antibiotic and, antibacterial and so on. And so they worry about it killing the bacteria and yeast that get you a good ferment, but that's not the case when it comes to that. So it ferments. It's excellent for fermenting. And again, the only reason I don't use raw honey for all of my ferments is simply the cost. That's it. If we ever get to a point where we're keeping bees, I'd be using honey a lot more. And by the way, if you would like to learn more about how to make your own fermentation starter, it's super easy. It's very similar to making vinegar. The difference is vinegar takes 30 days, where-ish, it can, give or take a few days, where your fermentation starter is ready in 3 to 4 days. You're not trying to turn this to vinegar. You're just trying to get it to the point where it's fizzy, and then you can use it for all of your ferments, including wine and mead making. And I even use it for fermenting eggs and kimchi and, well, pretty much anything, even bread. I've used it a few times in making like a homemade pizza crust and just a loaf bread. It's a little more tricky to use than a dry active yeast, but you can use it in bread making in a pinch for sure. So anyway, super easy. And so what I'll link to down below is I'll link to the video on the in-depth video I did on the fermentation starter. I'll also link to one of my very many vinegar making videos. And then, like I said, I'll have the whole wine making series in there and the sugar amounts video. I'll link to that below. So there'll be at least 4 different video links. And if I think of anything else that you might find beneficial, like maybe even if you want to know how I make a brine-free kimchi using my fermentation starter, I'll put that down below, but you can always do a search on my channel for whatever else that I might have out there. Just make sure you put Rain Country, put my channel name, and put what it is you're looking for in the YouTube search bar at the top. some of these things like the vinegar making, I have tons of vinegar making videos out there and tons of Q&A videos in relation to making vinegar. Oh, and one more thing I want to say before I close out, I got to say this again. You cannot use things like stevia and other non-nutritive sweeteners if you're trying to make vinegar or wine. Those aren't going to work. All they're going to do is they're going to give you a sweet wine or a sweet vinegar, but they're not going to ferment. They're not going to turn to alcohol and then to vinegar. You have to have a real sugar to do that. So I wanted to stress that once again because I get that question quite a bit. Anyway, I hope you enjoyed this video. Thanks for watching. Take care and God bless.